Hi, I'm Siobhan Benita and I'm the Liberal Democrat candidate for Mayor of London in 2020. It's really good to have the opportunity to talk today about what I think and what the party thinks about drugs reform in the UK, because I think it's really important that we finally address this issue, because it's evidently clear to me, especially from the London context, that we are actually losing the so-called war on drugs. So I think it's just kind of head in the sand not to address this and not to actually do something about it. So I'm very proud to be a member of a party, I think we're the only national party now who is in favour of having a regulated market for cannabis. And I'm very happy to talk a bit more about why I think that's especially important in the London context. I think there are several reasons why I personally, and I agree with the party line on this, that we should look at drugs reform, that we should actually bring about drugs reform. There are lots of reasons. One of them, I think we have to accept that the current situation is not working. Drugs are everywhere. You only have to look around you, whether it's on the streets in London, whether it's in universities, whether it's professional people going about their jobs. It's very easy to access drugs on the illegal market at the moment. So the current situation just isn't working. That's one argument for it. I think the damage that it does is a hugely powerful argument for drugs reform. So for the last nearly 3 years now, I've been working on a cross-party commission looking at the underlying causes of youth violence, and all the evidence that we gathered as part of that exercise, whether it was through talking to people in Parliament. We had 6 sessions where we invited people in to come and give us evidence in Parliament, or whether it's through a survey we did a survey of over 2,000 young people between the ages of 8 and 24, and all of the evidence showed that there was a correlation between people getting either affected by violence as a perpetrator or becoming victims of violence. There was a correlation between that and exposure to the illegal drugs market. So we know that the illegal drugs market is one of the driving factors behind the violence that we're seeing at the moment in London. There is actually a liberal argument as the Liberal Party for people to be allowed to take these substances. However, I do think, especially now I've got a politician's hat on, I think that's a harder argument to put to the public. I'm not sure the public are there yet. Having said that though, when you look around the world, this isn't really a controversial issue anymore. There are so many countries now, so many states in America, there are so many countries who in one way or another have already brought in some kind of regulation or decriminalisation of the drugs market, that I think it's way overdue that we do something here in this country. So there are several prongs to the Liberal Democrat approach to drugs reform. So the first one is we would like to stop criminalising people for personal possession of drugs. We want to stop putting people in prison. We want to stop getting people into the criminal justice system because of possession of drugs, and actually instead look at a more supportive approach. So if people are found to have a serious drugs problem, for example, I think we should provide support rather than punishment in that instance. There's a real economic issue to this as well, especially when it comes to the overstretched police resources that we have. I don't think police should be wasting their time on dealing with people that have especially small amounts of drugs on their personal possession, especially when we know that politicians themselves have taken drugs. You know, we've heard that in the Tory leadership. There's a massive hypocrisy there if we're continuing with this drugs policy when so many politicians themselves are admitting that they've taken drugs themselves. So that's one part of the drugs policy, to stop the kind of criminalisation aspect of it. The other one is to look at a properly regulated market for cannabis. And again, as I said, this is not that controversial. This is already done in lots of parts of the world already. We are already saying certain, I think, positive, we welcome certain things about the medical cannabis, although that's not actually working on the ground. We would like to see that become a lot more accessible, a lot more easy to access. But actually for recreational use as well, I think there's a really now powerful argument to be said that you should bring in a regulated market Not only could you then tax that, so actually there is potential revenue there, and I think a study that the party did a couple of years ago now, there's potential for significant amounts of tax revenue if you regulate the cannabis market. At the moment, that money is going into the hands of kind of the criminalised gangs, so actually they are making money out of this, when actually we could be getting tax revenue from this market and actually putting that into some of our services like the NHS and police and mental health services. So there's an economic argument for it as well. There's also a safety issue that if you regulate the market, one, you can ensure that the drugs are only sold to people over 18, you could set that, and also you can ensure the quality of what's being sold and the strength of what's being sold. As a mother of two, they're now 19 and 20, my daughters, but as they've grown up and I've looked at what they and their friends have done since they were kind of 14, 15, not naming any names, as a parent, as a mother, I would have been much happier knowing that if young people are going to go and buy drugs, which we know they will, you want to know that the substances that they are buying are safe and that they know what's in them. At the moment, I think there are a lot of young people out there using substances that they really don't know what's in that, and so there's a safety aspect as well to this. So they are the kind of two aspects, the two key aspects of what a Liberal Democrat policy on drugs reform would cover. Well, I joined the Liberal Democrats 3 years ago. I joined after the EU referendum, and already drugs reform and bringing in a regulated market was party policy. So it's in our manifesto. I'm not entirely sure how long it's been there. It's certainly been there as long as I've been a party member. And I don't know if people are aware, but as Liberal Democrats, it's members that decide our policy. So everything is very democratically decided in the party. So that means that as a party, we are fully behind this because we believe it's the right thing to do. It's not something that we're doing because it's suddenly become kind of trendy in some way, or that we think now is the moment where you're going to get votes out of this. We've had people in our party, people like Norman Lamb, who've been championing this for many, many years. I'm personally hugely supportive of this at this stage because of the work that I've been doing here in London on the underlying causes of serious violence and serious violence affecting young people that we're seeing in London. And I know the link between the illegal drugs market and lots of our young people becoming vulnerable to violence because they get pulled into that black market for drugs. So I'm so delighted that the party has had this policy for a long time, and that actually now we are pushing it through the public health lens, because I think that's the one where you're going to be pushing more on an open door, where people can actually see now the huge positive impact that might have. I think lots of other parties maybe are toying with the idea of doing this. I don't think any of them are really brave enough, like we're doing, in that kind of properly to be leaders on this and say, all the evidence is clear, this is what we need going forward. And that's where I think the Liberal Democrats are different and have been different on this for a long time, actually. So it's interesting in the context of London to ask, I guess, why other parties or other politicians haven't really been braver on this issue before now. And I have to admit, running up to kind of an election myself in May next year, you do wonder, and you do have to worry about how is this going to go down with voters. Actually, I think in London now, the public mood is very much in favour of drugs reform. And it's interesting that recently the Evening Standard did a survey themselves looking at should we start a conversation about whether it's time to legalise cannabis. They were looking at cannabis, and 63% in that initial survey seem to be supportive of now is the moment to bring in drugs reform, looking at cannabis in particular. And I think what we're seeing in London overwhelmingly is not only are people realising that prohibition hasn't worked, because you can just see how easy it is to get drugs in the capital, they're also seeing the hugely damaging impact of that illegal drugs market in London. So we've seen all of the appalling violence, the appalling murders that we've had. So many of those have been driven by the illegal drugs market. So I think people are realising that if you can remove the power from those organised criminal gangs and take back control of that drugs market, then so many of those problems should actually go away. So the public mood in London, I think, is very much now behind looking at how do we reform this, how do we take back control. I think that is about how do we, rather than let the criminal organised gangs, how do we actually get control on the streets, and how do we make sure that people who are taking drugs in London, that they know what they're taking. I think that's a really big issue, and I think there are so many families in London now that have been affected by the violence going on in London and who don't want their young people to continue to be affected by this, who are looking for that real change. Okay, so I think one of the things that we're fortunate now to be in a position is that we can learn from where other countries have actually done this. And I think there's about 10 states in the United States that have legalised cannabis, and they're all bringing it in slightly different ways, so you can do a compare and contrast and see what's worked. There are different countries across Europe that have brought it into different extents, that have maybe regulated the sale but not the production, that kind of thing. One of the things we have to be really careful about if we bring in drugs reform and a regulation of cannabis in this country is to make sure that we just don't shift one problem from, say, a kind of organised criminal activity over here to a real commercial model over here, because that could have negative implications as well. So I think whatever we do, our party policy is very clear that actually that regulation aspect would have to be very carefully controlled, very tight. We would have to make sure that safety came first, ultimately, in everything that we do. But like I say, there's a lot of practice out there now that we can learn from, and we would certainly be doing this in a very evidence-based driven way going forward. So it's not that we are just opening it all up and it is a free-for-all. The regulation would be looked at very, very carefully. It's not that we're going to be front runners in this, we're behind the curve, and actually it's time that we took some action to make London a much safer place for everybody.